A soldier forgotten. The story of Maverick. Rain drizzled over the quiet streets of a small Pennsylvania town, washing over the cracked pavement and turning puddles into mirrors that reflected the flickering glow of streetlights. The town had once been lively, but time had slowed it down, much like the man who now sat on the porch of a modest butcher shop, watching the world move past him in silence. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Samuel Sam Whitaker, a retired officer, sipped his lukewarm coffee, his grip firm despite the arthritis that gnawed at his knuckles. At 72, his body had grown slower, but his mind remained sharp, always observing, always watching. The night air carried the scent of raw meat from his shop, mixing with the earthy freshness of rain. It was a peaceful evening until he noticed the shadow near his doorstep. A lone German shepherd sat on the sidewalk, his dark, intelligent eyes locked onto the butcher shop window. The dim street lamp revealed his frail frame ribs protruding beneath a dull, matted coat, patches of fur missing, old scars weaving stories of past battles. But he did not move. He did not beg. He just waited. Sam's gaze narrowed. There was something different about this dog. Most strays scavenged, fought over scraps, ran from people, but not this one. He sat straight despite his clear exhaustion, his ears alert despite the rain weighing him down. Discipline. Training. Sam knew that look. Setting down his coffee, Sam stood, his boots creaking against the wooden porch. He took a cautious step forward, kneeling slightly. "You a lost soldier, boy?" he murmured, extending a hand. The dog flinched, just slightly. His ears twitched, but he did not growl, did not retreat. Instead, he held his ground, his muscles coiled, waiting. And then Sam saw a faded tattoo on the dog's ear. Recognition dawned like a sudden sunrise. "Canine unit," he whispered, realization sinking in. Maverick, that had been his name once. He had been an officer, a protector. He had chased criminals, sniffed out explosives, stood between danger and the ones he loved. But those days were gone. One injury, a wound to his hind leg, had ended his career. At first, his handler had fought to keep him, as many did with their retired canine partners. But somehow, Maverick had slipped through the cracks. A mix-up in the system. A bureaucratic failure. He had been discarded, left behind. Sam clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath his usually controlled exterior. He had seen men like Maverick before, loyal, brave, and then abandoned when they were no longer deemed useful. He saw it in veterans, in old officers left behind by the force they had once given their lives to. And now in a dog who still sat with dignity, despite having nothing left. Sam exhaled slowly, his heart unexpectedly heavy. He reached into the bag of fresh meat beside him, pulled out a thick cut, and placed it gently in front of the shepherd. Maverick hesitated, his training holding him back, but then hunger won. He devoured the meal with careful, measured bites, never once losing his composure. Sam watched in silence, his decision already made. "Come on, boy," he finally said, stepping back and pushing the door open. Maverick lifted his head, hesitating. This was new. No one had invited him in before. For a long moment, the dog remained frozen, as if afraid to believe in kindness again. But then, something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of trust, of recognition. With slow, cautious steps, Maverick crossed the threshold, stepping into the warmth of the shop. That night, for the first time in years, Maverick slept without fear. A second chance. Days passed. Then weeks. Maverick grew stronger under Sam's care, his fur regaining its sheen, his ribs slowly vanishing beneath healthy weight. But it wasn't just the physical transformation, it was the way his spirit healed. Sam never treated Maverick as a pet. He treated him as an equal, a partner. Together, they fell into a rhythm: early morning walks, quiet evenings by the fire, shared meals of steak and eggs. Sam even set up an old cot for Maverick beside his own bed, though he often found the shepherd curled up near the front door, still standing watch. And for the first time since Margaret, his wife of 40 years, had passed, Sam didn't feel alone anymore. Maverick hadn't just found a home. He'd found purpose again. A hero remembered. One evening, A commotion outside the shop sent Sam to his feet. A woman screamed. A man's voice barked threats. Sam grabbed his old service revolver, but before he could react, Maverick was already there. The shepherd moved like a shadow, launching himself between the woman and the attacker. His growl rumbled through the street, low and deadly. The man hesitated just long enough for Sam to step in, his voice sharp, commanding. The would-be assailant fled. The woman, shaken but unharmed, stared at Maverick in awe. "That dog saved me." Sam knelt beside Maverick, ruffling the fur behind his ears. "Yeah," he said with a small smile. "That's what he does." A legacy of loyalty. News of Maverick's rescue spread through the town. The once-forgotten canine became a local hero, his story echoing through the community. People brought him treats, stopped to pet him, even asked about his past. But for Sam, Maverick was never just a hero. He was family. Years passed. Maverick grew old, his steps slower, his once powerful body finally betraying him. One autumn morning, Sam found him lying on the porch, his breathing steady but weak. The old shepherd lifted his head, met Sam's gaze, and thumped his tail one last time. Sam sat beside him, resting a hand on his back. "You did good, boy," he whispered. "Real good." Maverick passed quietly, surrounded by the only home he had ever truly known. A bond that never fades. Later, the town honored Maverick with a plaque outside the butcher shop. It read, "Maverick, a warrior, a guardian, a friend, forever watching over us." Sam never got another dog. He didn't need to, because every morning, as he sipped his coffee on the porch, he could almost feel Maverick still there, keeping watch. And in the rustling of the trees, in the quiet strength of the town that had come to love him, Maverick's spirit remained. The forgotten soldier, Maverick's second chance. The rain had lessened, but the cold still clung to Maverick's bones. He had learned to endure it, just as he had learned to endure hunger, pain, and the weight of being unwanted. Yet, something about tonight felt different. The butcher, his sharp eyes unwavering, his posture steady, didn't shoo him away, didn't scowl or throw scraps in disgust. He simply watched and waited. Maverick had once been trained to watch too, to wait for a command, to follow orders, to trust. But trust had been stripped from him the day he was abandoned, left to fend for himself on these unforgiving streets. Yet, despite everything, he still followed his training. He didn't beg. He didn't steal. He just waited. The butcher sighed, rubbing his calloused fingers over his beard, his thoughts clouded with something unfamiliar, something that twisted at his chest. He had seen plenty of strays before, but this wasn't a dog that had always been wild. This was a soldier without orders, a warrior left behind. And suddenly, it was clear Maverick wasn't just another stray. He had belonged to someone once. Someone who had failed him. The butcher crouched down slowly, his voice calm but firm. "You're not just some lost dog, are you?" Maverick didn't move, but his ears twitched, his sharp eyes flickering with recognition. The man's voice had carried authority but not cruelty. A voice that might have once given commands. A sigh left the butcher's lips. He wasn't sure what had drawn him to this moment, to this battered dog that had clearly been through hell. Maybe it was the way Maverick held himself, despite the hunger clawing at his ribs. Maybe it was the silent question in the dog's eyes, a question no one else had bothered to answer. Whatever it was, he couldn't just walk away. "Come inside," he said, stepping back and pushing the shop door open just enough for the warmth to spill onto the wet pavement. Maverick hesitated. This was new. No one had ever invited him in before. The streets had been his home for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to have shelter, to feel safe. But there was something about this man, something steady, something familiar in the way he moved, in the way he didn't demand trust, but offered it freely. A moment passed. Then another. And then Maverick took a step forward. The butcher held his breath as the dog crossed the threshold, his body tense as if expecting the door to slam shut behind him. But it didn't. Inside, the warmth was overwhelming. The scent of fresh meat, the crackle of the heater in the corner, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Maverick stood just inside the door, his paws hesitant on the dry floor. The butcher shut the door behind him, sealing them both in. "Guess that settles it," he murmured, shaking his head. "You're staying." Maverick didn't move for a long time. Then, ever so slowly, he sat down. Not relaxed, not comfortable, but not ready to run either. That was enough. A second chance. Days passed. Then weeks. Maverick didn't leave. At first, he kept his distance, curling up near the door, always watching. But as the days stretched on, he began to settle into the rhythm of the shop. He learned that the butcher Samuel, as he later heard others call him, was a man of quiet routine. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. Every morning, Samuel would leave out a fresh bowl of water, a plate of leftover meat. He didn't force interaction, didn't try to pet him, he just let Maverick be. And that was how trust began to take root again. It was slow, like thawing ice, but it was real. One morning, Maverick followed Samuel to the back of the shop. Samuel stopped, arching a brow. "Didn't think you'd come this far," he muttered, tossing a thick bone into a bowl. Maverick took it without hesitation this time. Trust, in small steps. By the third week, Maverick no longer slept by the door. He moved to the corner of the shop, where the scent of Samuel's presence lingered strongest. By the fourth, he began following him as he worked, a silent shadow, always watching. And then, one night, something changed. The test of loyalty. Samuel was closing up late when he heard a sharp rustling noise from the alley behind the shop. He turned, frowning, wiping his hands on his apron. Maverick was already up, ears forward, muscles coiled. Samuel barely had time to react before the back door rattled. A figure lurked in the shadows, their hands fumbling with the lock. A break-in. Samuel's instincts kicked in, but before he could even step forward, Maverick lunged. A snarl ripped through the quiet night, the sound of a soldier back in his element, a flash of teeth, a sharp bark, pure unwavering authority. The intruder stumbled back, cursing, fleeing before Samuel could even get a look at his face. Maverick didn't chase. He stood at the doorway, body rigid, waiting for Samuel's approval. The butcher let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Still got some fight in you, huh?" he murmured. Maverick wagged his tail for the first time. A home found. The next morning, Samuel took a drive to the vet, Maverick sitting stiffly in the passenger seat. "You've earned a checkup," the butcher grumbled, though there was no annoyance in his voice. The vet confirmed what Samuel already knew. Maverick had been a police 9, trained and disciplined, once a hero. But he was more than that now. He was family. Samuel didn't change much after that, but he did one thing. He took an old collar, scratched and worn, and fastened it around Maverick's neck. And just like that, Maverick wasn't a stray anymore. He was home. Maverick's choice. Maverick stood motionless, his damp fur clinging to his bones, the warmth of the butcher shop seeping into his skin like an unfamiliar embrace. His breath was slow, measured. The door behind him remained open, the cold wind whispering promises of solitude and struggle. The choice was his. Stay or go. For so long, decisions had been made for him. He had followed orders without hesitation, acted on instinct molded by discipline. Now there was no command, no stern voice telling him what to do, just a silent invitation and a towel on the floor. A place to rest. He swallowed, the scent of raw meat lingering in the air, a temptation he had resisted for days. Hunger gnawed at his insides, but something deeper twisted inside him doubt. The butcher, still wiping down the counter, didn't look at him. He worked in quiet, treating Maverick's presence as something ordinary, as though stray dogs walked into his shop every day. That was the unsettling part. No shouts, no threats, no chains, just acceptance. Maverick's ears flicked as the man moved toward the back of the shop. He didn't rush, didn't slam doors or stomp his feet. His presence was solid, steady, like an anchor against the chaos Maverick had known for so long. The German shepherd's gaze shifted back to the towel on the floor. His paws ached from the rain, from the endless walking, from the restless nights spent curled up in doorways and alleyways. His ribs ached from hunger. Just dry off. It wasn't a command. It was a choice. Finally, slowly, Maverick lowered himself onto the towel, his muscles still tense as if expecting the moment to be ripped away from him. He didn't relax completely, didn't close his eyes, but the relief of something soft beneath him, something dry, was enough. The butcher returned, carrying a metal bowl. He set it down a few feet away from Maverick, filled with fresh cuts of beef. "Eat," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Maverick hesitated. He had waited in the rain, stomach empty, body trembling, but never once had he begged. His training wouldn't allow it. Food was earned. The butcher must have sensed the hesitation because he sighed and ran a hand over his beard. "I'm not expecting anything in return," he muttered. "Just eat." Maverick's eyes locked onto his. He had spent years reading people, understanding intent in the smallest of gestures. This man wasn't lying. Cautiously, Maverick took a step toward the bowl. He lowered his head, his nose twitching at the scent of the fresh meat. Still, he waited, expecting the food to be snatched away at the last second. It didn't happen. So, he ate. Not just another stray. As Maverick chewed in slow, deliberate motions, the butcher leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You weren't always like this," he said after a moment. Maverick's ears twitched. The man nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. "You were trained. A cop's dog, weren't you?" The words settled in the air between them, heavy with truth. Maverick stilled for a brief moment, his past creeping up on him like a shadow. The sound of sirens. The firm grip of a handler's hand on his harness. The adrenaline of a chase. The betrayal. Maverick swallowed, lowering his gaze. The butcher didn't push for more. He just sighed, shaking his head. "People don't always do right by the ones who give him everything," he muttered. Maverick wasn't sure if he was talking about him or something else, but the words settled deep in his chest. The butcher stood up straight and gestured toward the back room. "Got an old cot in the storage room. It ain't fancy, but it's warm." Maverick's body tensed again. Another choice. He could leave. The streets were waiting, as they always had. The cold, the hunger, the uncertainty, those things were familiar. But the shop smelled like safety. It smelled like something he had lost. Without a sound, Maverick stood, muscles stiff, and padded toward the back. The butcher didn't follow immediately. He let him go, as if knowing Maverick needed the space to decide. In the storage room, Maverick found the cot. It smelled of dust and old fabric, but it was dry, and it was his if he wanted it. Maverick turned in slow circles, testing the space, testing the feeling of having something of his own again. Then, cautiously, he lay down. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he closed his eyes. A home, maybe. Maverick didn't leave the next morning. Or the next. The butcher didn't ask him to stay, didn't put a leash on him, didn't try to claim him as his own. He just left the back door open when he unlocked the shop each morning, let Maverick come and go as he pleased. And little by little, Maverick stayed. He watched the shop, sitting by the entrance as customers came and went. He learned the rhythms of the place, the smells, the sounds. The butcher started calling him by name. It wasn't the same name his handler had given him, but Maverick didn't mind. That name had been given to a soldier. This one was given to him. One evening, as the butcher sat in his old chair near the fire, Maverick walked over and laid his head on the man's knee. The butcher paused, then rested a hand lightly on his head, rough fingers brushing over his fur. "Guess that means you're staying," he murmured. Maverick sighed, his eyes half closing. Not a command. Not an order. Just a choice. And for the first time in a long time, he had chosen home. A place to rest. Maverick lowered his head, his nose brushing against the bowl as the scent of fresh meat filled his senses. His stomach twisted with hunger, but still, he hesitated. Take the food. Be ready to run. That was how survival worked. But the butcher wasn't watching him like a man waiting for something in return. He had already turned away, busying himself with the last of his evening work. There was no leash, no command. Just quiet expectation that Maverick would eat if he wanted to. And so, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Maverick let himself take a bite. The taste hit him like a flood, real food, not scraps, not garbage, not something stolen out of necessity. His instincts screamed at him to devour it all before it disappeared, but he forced himself to chew slowly, to keep control. He was still wired for discipline, for restraint, even now, when there was no one left to demand it from him. The butcher didn't acknowledge his eating, not with words or looks, and somehow that made it easier. A soldier without orders. The rain outside had softened to a drizzle, tapping against the shop's windows in a rhythmic lull. Maverick finished his meal, licking the bowl clean before lifting his head. His body remained taut, as if expecting a trick, a sudden change in circumstances that would send him back into the cold. But nothing changed. The butcher wiped down his counter, flicked off the overhead light, and stretched with a quiet groan. "All right," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Time to turn in." He disappeared into the back room, his boots thudding lightly against the worn floorboards. He left the door open just enough for Maverick to see a cot in the corner, a heavy quilt folded neatly at the foot. Nothing fancy, but lived in, real. The butcher hesitated, then glanced back at Maverick. "There's space if you want it," he said simply, nodding toward the floor beside the cot. Then he left it at that. No coaxing, no commands. Maverick's choice. The German Shepherd remained where he was, his dark eyes flicking between the open doorway and the locked entrance to the shop. The night still called to him, familiar and full of solitude. But solitude meant hunger, cold, weariness so deep that his bones ached. His paws shifted against the wood floor. For months, his world had been simple: find food, find shelter, keep moving. There was no room for trust, no time to linger. But tonight, for the first time, there was no immediate threat. No enemy. No expectation. Just a quiet place, warm and still. Cautiously, Maverick rose to his feet. He stretched, shaking off the last remnants of rain from his fur before padding toward the open door. The butcher had already settled onto the cot, one arm draped over his eyes, breathing slow and steady. Maverick stepped into the room. The floor beside the cot was bare, but the wood was warm beneath his paws. He turned in a slow circle, then, hesitantly, lowered himself down. He didn't curl into himself the way he usually did in alleyways or doorways. He didn't brace for the night to turn on him. Instead, he rested. A new routine. Mornings came early in the butcher shop. The scent of fresh bread and meat filled the air before the sun even fully rose, and Maverick stirred at the first sound of movement. The butcher didn't acknowledge him right away. He moved through his routine, washing his hands, preparing his knives, organizing the morning's deliveries. It wasn't until he noticed Maverick still lying beside the cot, ears alert but body at ease, that he spoke. "Guess that means you're staying," he said simply. Maverick didn't move. The butcher smirked, shaking his head as he pulled out a second bowl this time, filling it with water. "Got rules, though," he continued. "No begging. No stealing. No biting customers, even if they deserve it." He set the bowl down near Maverick's feet, then stood, waiting. The German Shepherd lifted his head, studying him. There was something familiar about this: rules, structure, expectations, a place to belong. Maverick leaned forward and lapped at the water. The butcher gave a small, satisfied nod. "Good boy." A silent understanding. Days passed, then weeks. Maverick never left. He spent his mornings lying near the shop's entrance, watching customers come and go. Some ignored him. Others gave him wary glances, but a few, the ones who understood, offered quiet nods of acknowledgement. The butcher didn't make a big deal out of his presence. He simply let Maverick exist alongside him, as though the dog had always been there. He never tried to leash him, never tried to cage him in. And for Maverick, that was enough. One evening, as the butcher locked up, he paused by the cot, glancing down at the German Shepherd curled at its base. "You ever had a real home, Maverick?" he asked softly. Maverick's ear twitched at the sound of his name, but he didn't lift his head. The butcher exhaled, shaking his head. "Guess it don't matter much now," he murmured, flicking off the light. Maverick closed his eyes. For the first time in months, he didn't dream of running. A new beginning. Maverick followed the butcher into the back of the shop, his paws patting quietly against the worn wooden floor. The scent of fresh meat was stronger here, mingling with the sharper tang of steel and spices. His movements were cautious, but not fearful. This was still unfamiliar territory, but there was no immediate danger. No leash, no orders, just the quiet, steady rhythm of something new. The butcher moved with ease, opening the heavy refrigerator door and grabbing a slab of beef. He worked in silence, slicing it into smaller pieces before setting them down in a dish on the floor. "Eat," he muttered. Maverick's ears twitched at the familiar command, but there was no force behind it, just quiet expectation. Still, he hesitated for a moment, his old training clashing with survival instincts. In the past, food had always been given under strict rules. But this was something different. An offering, not a demand. Slowly, Maverick lowered his head and ate. Not with the desperation of a stray, but with the measured control of a soldier who had never forgotten his discipline. The butcher watched, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "You're not like the others," he murmured. "You still got a code." Maverick didn't lift his head, but something in his posture shifted at the words. The butcher was right. He wasn't just a stray. He had been something once. A protector. A partner. A canine trained for duty. And somewhere along the way, that had been taken from him. But maybe, just maybe, not everything had been lost. The soldier's routine. As the days passed, the butcher settled back into his usual rhythm. But now, there was a quiet presence in the shop that hadn't been there before. Maverick didn't leave. In the mornings, he watched as the butcher prepared the day's cuts, his sharp eyes scanning the doorway, the streets beyond. His body remained still, but his ears flicked at every unfamiliar noise, every shift in the world outside. The butcher noticed. "Damn watchdog," he muttered one afternoon when he caught Maverick staring at a man loitering near the entrance a little too long. "Bet you could still run a full patrol if you had to." Maverick didn't react, but the way he squared his shoulders told the butcher all he needed to know. The instinct never left. And so, without discussion, without any spoken agreement, a routine formed. Maverick stayed near the entrance when customers arrived, watching with quiet attentiveness. He never barked, never growled, never lunged, but he was there, his presence enough to make even the most confident of strangers pause before stepping inside. The butcher started leaving a water bowl by the back door. A second towel near the cot in the back room. Small things, never spoken about, but acknowledged in their own way. They didn't need words. The ghost of a name. One evening, as the butcher wiped down the counters, he glanced toward the cot where Maverick had settled for the night. The dog's eyes were half-lidded, but his body remained tense, as if still waiting for something, a command, an order, a reason to move. The butcher exhaled, rubbing a hand over his beard. "You had a name, didn't you?" he muttered. Maverick's ear flicked at the sound. The butcher thought for a long moment. "I ain't calling you dog forever," he said. He let the silence stretch between them before muttering, "Maverick." The name felt right. It wasn't the name given to him by the Force, by the handlers who had discarded him. It was something new, something his own. Maverick lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting the butcher's for the briefest of moments. A flicker of recognition. The butcher gave a small nod. "Yeah," he murmured. "That suits you." And just like that, he was no longer just another stray. The first test. A week later, the test came. It was late, past closing hours, when the knock rattled against the butcher shop door. A sharp, impatient sound that immediately put Maverick on edge. The butcher frowned, setting down his knife before wiping his hands on his apron. He walked toward the entrance, but before he could reach for the lock, Maverick was already there. His posture had shifted, his stance no longer relaxed, but ready. His ears were forward, muscles coiled, his dark eyes locked onto the figure beyond the glass. The butcher followed his gaze. Outside, a man stood hunched against the rain. Maverick didn't move, but his presence alone seemed to send a message. The man hesitated. His fingers twitched toward his jacket. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away. The butcher exhaled, his fingers tightening on the doorknob before he released it. He glanced down at Maverick, whose gaze remained locked on the retreating figure until he disappeared into the night. The butcher smirked. "Well," he muttered. "Guess you do still know how to do your job." Maverick didn't wag his tail, didn't seek praise. He simply returned to his spot near the counter, lowering himself onto the floor, ears still perked. Watching. Not just a stray. Weeks passed. The streets grew colder, the nights longer, but Maverick never left. He had a place now. A purpose. And though he still carried the scars of the past, the weight of abandonment, of betrayal, of lost orders, he no longer wandered without direction. Because now, he had chosen where to be. And that choice made all the difference. Maverick's story is more than just a tale of an abandoned canine finding a new purpose. It reflects the universal struggle of loss, resilience, and the search for meaning. In many ways, his journey mirrors the experiences of countless people who have dedicated their lives to something greater than themselves, only to find themselves cast aside when they are no longer deemed useful. Whether it's a retired worker struggling to find purpose after decades in a career, a veteran adjusting to civilian life, or an elderly individual facing loneliness after years of raising a family, the lesson remains the same. We all need purpose, and we all deserve a second chance. Maverick's discipline and training were once his identity, much like how people shape their lives around careers, relationships, or responsibilities. When that identity was stripped away, he was lost, unsure of where he belonged. Many people go through similar experiences after retirement, after the loss of a loved one, or even after children grow up and move away. The world that once revolved around them suddenly feels distant, and they are left wondering where they fit in. The fear of being forgotten, of becoming irrelevant, is real and painful. But Maverick's story teaches us that while circumstances may change, our value does not. Just because he was no longer a working canine didn't mean he had no worth. His instincts, his intelligence, and his loyalty were still very much intact. It took someone a butcher who saw past the dirt and scars to recognize that Maverick was more than just a stray. Similarly, in life, people need someone to remind them that they still have something to offer, that their presence still matters. Sometimes, that someone is a friend, a family member, or even a stranger. Other times, it's the person themselves, realizing that their story isn't over yet. The butcher's approach was equally important. He didn't force Maverick to trust him, didn't push him into a decision. Instead, he offered an open door, a space to rest, to heal, to choose whether to stay or go. This is a powerful lesson in how we should treat those going through difficult transitions in life. Whether it's a grieving spouse, a struggling friend, or even ourselves, true healing happens when there is patience, space, and quiet acceptance. Trust cannot be rushed. It must be built step by step, moment by moment. Maverick's ultimate decision to stay wasn't because he was forced into it, but because he found a place where he was valued not for what he could do, but for who he was. In today's fast-moving world, where people are often judged by their productivity or usefulness, this is an important reminder. Our worth is not measured by what we produce, but by the connections we make, the lives we touch, and the love we give and receive. In the end, Maverick wasn't just a dog given a second chance. He was a symbol of resilience, of finding purpose after loss, of the quiet strength that comes from choosing to stay and belong. And perhaps that's a lesson we all need to remember. If this story touches your heart, take a moment to reflect on the power of resilience and love. Together, we can celebrate the bonds that make life extraordinary. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories.